Welcome to the Mama's Boys podcast. I'm your host, Omar Yusuf. My fellow host is Silent Mike, also known as Mike Farr. We have merchandise available for Mama's Boys podcast at mamasboyspodcast.com, as well as you can sign up for our Patreon, where we give exclusive bonus episodes and other content on there. You can find that as well on mamasboyspodcast.com. Coming to you live, the Mama's Boys podcast, the best, worst podcast in the world, with your host, Omar Yusuf, aka Homer Surf Clam, the first and only true professional toner in the history of lifting. This is the Mama's Boys podcast. Welcome, everyone. This will be a solo show, so if you're expecting Quiet Michael, Young Michael, Silencio Mikel, he will not be in this episode today, but he's coming back. You see, we're figuring out this recording in different countries thing. I live in Canada, more specifically Toronto. Mike lives in California. He's currently traveling in Boston, and so we're figuring it out, and that's why I know it's been a little bit of time. I apologize. All right, just lower your voice. I said I apologize, all right? I can only apologize so many times for the lack of uploads on the podcast. We will be uploading every Tuesday and Friday once again moving forward. We're currently planning the biggest trip for the Mama's Boys podcast, because guess what? We're going to Texas, and I will tease more later, but the Mama's Boys podcast, the goal is to expand beyond fitness. And so, yes, we love talking about fitness. Fitness is a huge part of both of our lives, but there's a lot of other things that we want to talk about. On the average episode of a Mama's Boys podcast, we might talk about conspiracy theories, UFOs, John Carpenter movies, Pride FC, why Kanye West is overrated, my opinion, and maybe bestiality. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. We don't know what we're getting ourselves into. And maybe before I go on, when it comes to this episode today, I should describe the situation right here, which is I'm recording this in my house, no pants on because it's hot. It's approximately 32 degrees Celsius with some humidity. Fahrenheit, I'm just going to spitball it. I'm going to say it's 90. No pants, and that probably was going to be the name we were going to call this podcast. There's a few, and maybe to go into the origins a little bit before I start riffing on what I want to talk about. We were going to call this podcast the Pants Off Podcast, which means just, you come home from work, you whip those pants off. At least I used to do that, or just in general, I like doing that. Sit down, relax, and listen to this casual, conversational podcast where we go anywhere and everywhere with our guests, and we also just riff on our own a whole bunch. So Pants Off Podcast was a big contender, as well as No Crust Podcast. And the idea behind No Crust, and then we found out once again, all the other names of podcasts were taken besides No Crust and Mama's Boys. So we decided to go with the Mama's Boys Podcast. But No Crust, we like the name No Crust because to us, it signifies just the meat, just the substance, just the heart. Because, some people might use flowery words. Some people might try and go on that hype train talking about current events or whatever, where they're just rambling on and on. The Mama's Boys podcast is always 100% authentic. It is our opinions. We're not saying we're right, but we are going to give our opinions. And so the No Crust podcast, we put it to a vote. However, and so Mama's Boys podcast did win out, and that's why it's the name. Why do we call it that? And maybe this is the origin story episode number 50 something. I can't count. Basically, the idea behind Mama's Boys is that both of us, for a long time, lived with our mom. We are proud Mama's Boys, and it's just part of our identity. Some people, there might be that negative connotation where it's like, oh, what are you, Mama's Boys? It's like, yeah, you dumb bastard. I 100% am. I don't understand why that's a problem at all, and I'm just going to get closer to you if there is a problem and, maybe give you a hug because it sounds like you need a hug. That's the origin of the Mama's Boys podcast. And since then, we've evolved the episodes to talk about a lot of different things. And one of my goals, I don't know if it's one of Mike's goals, and that's why I'm going to speak for myself. because I don't want to speak for anyone else. It's also to show another side of your favorite content creators. And so you could bring on a guest, let's say once again, a lifter that lifts a lot of weight. And you can say, hey man, like tell us about that lifting heavy shit. It's like, well, you know what? Everybody has already asked that question or those questions. I find that boring. And so some of my favorite episodes are where things go off the rails. Like we had my man Kevin Oak on an episode, and he's a powerlifter. He has some records, but we talked a little bit about that, but we talked more about him working as a bouncer dash manager at a strip club. And that was far more fascinating to us because it's not only about the end result. This guy's a lifter. Cool. That's the end product. But what made this individual? What is this person really like? What's the 3D view of who this person is and what his opinions are? And so I think riffing off of someone else, I think improvisation, especially when it comes to a podcast, can be very powerful because that's how you unlock different conversations. And so for us, as you could probably tell, we riff all the time where I'll come in with the podcast, probably 2 to 3 topics in my head, and then we'll just go. And so one of the topics that I wanted to talk about today is the illusion of popularity. And so that's probably the biggest hipster title I've come up with yet, but wait, there'll be more. The illusion of popularity is that just because something is popular doesn't necessarily mean it's good. Most people will equate popularity with quality. So, oh, this movie, a lot of people watch it. It has to be good. It's a blockbuster. Oh my God, 100 million people listen to this person. They have to be really, really good. And I think the two are not strongly related. I think in a lot of ways, humans crave complexity. And so we want to do things that challenge us more and more over time. And so you could start off with something simple. Maybe, again, you'll read books or movies or music or even video games. Just think about video games. And maybe for a lot of you out there, you play a lot of video games. So I'm going to give an example. Yeah, you could play video games that hold your hand, walk you through everything. And they're basically like a movie in a video game format where it's a adrenaline rush. It's kind of like a movie theater experience. But that's only fun for so long because where's the challenge? Oh, well, I have unlimited lives. It's not really difficult to defeat any of the bosses. But why am I doing any of this? I think humans crave challenge and complexity. And so things that require skill, thinking, puzzles. And that's why, just talk about the Legend of Zelda for a second here. Why do you think The Legend of Zelda is so epic? It's because it combines a lot of different elements from different games into a holistic experience where, yeah, you're doing a little bit of adventuring, you're doing a little bit of action, you're doing some combat. There's some light RPG elements where you can upgrade your shield, your sword. There's a lot of exploration. There's that feeling of adventure, sense of adventure, of being the hero. You also have a silent protagonist, which is interesting. A lot of different elements and a lot of different styles of gameplay. And so I think in general, humans crave complexity over time. And so I personally believe that when it comes to popularity, a lot of times the most popular thing is the one that is the most palatable. And that means it's the most easily digested. So it has to be something that appeals to a lot of people. And sometimes when you do that, you lose all the edges, all the corners. And those are the things that make people, that make music, films, video games interesting. Sometimes being a little bit more divisive or a little bit more challenging, or maybe it's not intuitive right out of the gate can be a good thing. And so again, going with the video game example, you could use, and I'm going to say it, I don't like the Uncharted series of video games for the PlayStation. They're exactly what I don't want, which is a mediocre story. It's a crappy version of Indiana Jones with mediocre gameplay. The action elements don't particularly excel. So the platforming is not difficult or inventive. The combat is once again, where you're just inputting a few buttons. And then the shooting elements, once again, are mediocre, where nothing stands out, but it's a roller coaster ride. And so that does appeal to a lot of people. And again, they're not difficult. I remember at one point, I was trying to do this jump, and just by default, it kind of did it for me automatically. Where I did the jump, I kind of missed it. But even still, the game wants you to succeed. And so there's no sense of challenge or accomplishment and therefore meaning that I walked away just feeling empty. And so I played the first and second one and I called it quits after that. Dark Souls, on the other hand, talking about complexity or sometimes removing elements or being more divisive or not being easy or intuitive can be a good thing. Where Dark Souls and the predecessor, Demon Souls, which I highly recommend, both of them, you can't communicate. When you summon someone, you can't communicate with a cooperative player in any verbal form or really text. All you can do is follow them or they follow you. And so that's restricting elements of gameplay that have been around for a long period of time. But what that does instead, you figure out how to communicate non-verbally. And so it establishes a new method of communication. Also means you have to be more attentive when everything is being led to you or being explained to you explicitly. It removes that curiosity and that adventure. So removing some of those elements, in other words, being more divisive, where some people don't like that, right? Some people don't like the challenge of a game like Dark Souls, where it's too difficult. Oh man, you mean I actually have to learn enemy patterns? I'm gonna die? I didn't expect to die. What's going on here? Making it so that it appeals highly to a certain group of people while also pissing off a lot of individuals isn't a bad thing at all. And Dark Souls has eventually found its entire community. And now the series is incredibly popular. And that's just one example. I think sometimes in our quest to appeal to a broad audience, we lose the essence of what we're about or what we want to talk about. And so I hope the podcast will always be a place where we could keep it 100% real. Again, you might not agree with the opinions, but if it provokes you to think about things, to frame your mindset in a different way, then I think that's positive. And so the illusion of popularity is just because something is big means it's good. Oh, you know what? Avatar came out. It grossed the most amount of money ever for a movie. It has to be a really good movie. It's like, no, actually, again, it could be hyper palatable, or maybe there could be kind of a factor where this is different, this is new, it's unexpected. Oh no, a 3D movie, let's check it out. Some other thing to explain why it's so popular, but just because it's popular doesn't mean it's great. And I would say that applies across the board, no matter what you try and do. So for me, when I take a look at something, I try and always judge it on its own merits. And really, talking about video games once again, there's a lot of stellar video games that aren't selling 1 million, billion copies. It's not the Call of Duty, which is the same redundant game over and over. They compel you to think a little bit, to think outside of the box, to experience new things. And so one that I do want to mention for those that play games for a different type of game, but to have potentially a transformative experience where it affects you outside of just the video game, would be one called Gorgoa. So that's, I believe, I'm going to try and spell it here, Gorgoa. I just searched for it. It's on Steam. It's also on the Nintendo Switch and I think the PS4. It's a puzzle game. It's not long. It's only 2 to 3 hours. It's not very challenging, but it's an experience. And that's all I want to say about that game. And those that play it end up loving it, even if all you like is, Call of Duty, because it's a different type of experience. And I think sometimes when you don't chase popularity is when you create something new and something worthwhile. Because a lot of people, it's the copycat syndrome. Something will come out. Oh, look, it's popular. Then people think, oh shit, we should do that too. And what ends up happening, you get a lot of redundant carbon copies of the same thing. And eventually you chase that rabbit hole down far enough and you're so far removed from what made that thing popular in the first place, you're left with something that just sucks. And so you want to avoid that. I think Gorgoa is a really good example where a lot of people probably listening to this episode have not experienced that game yet, but there's tons of indie developers, and I'm going to give a huge shout out because I liked the Sega Genesis back in the day. It was the first real console that I owned. The Sonic Mania game that came out for the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation, Xbox, and PC was made by a fan, or I think a group of fans that used to riff and try and create Sonic levels on their own. Sega recognized that, saw how much they cared for the series, and they poured their heart and soul into it, the music as well. And what ended up happening, Sega was releasing, no offense to Sega, some pretty shitty Sonic games for quite a long period of time. Sonic Mania comes around where someone tries to do something different. They're not like, oh, we got to chase the latest pattern. Yeah, we're going to do a sandbox Sonic game where, Knuckles is going to be this wounded anti-hero, and then Sonic's kind of going to be the known protagonist. And we'll do a heel turn when it comes to Tails. It's like, no, let's just make a great Sonic game, and let's make a Sonic game that maybe people might not know that they want, but when they play it, they'll recognize why it's so good. And then they'll think, why have we not had this game before? So Sonic Mania is a good example of that. Coming out of the blue, a lot of people not expecting it, and then falling in love all over again. So the illusion of popularity, just because something gets a lot of views, a lot of likes, don't necessarily assume that it's good. And I think in general for our society, we need to do a better job of thinking for ourselves. And what I mean, if we want to see a movie, what's the first thing that we do? We go to Rotten Tomatoes, maybe we go to Metacritic. We need to validate the experience before we experience it. And if we don't recognize that very heavily colors our perception of what we're about to view, watch, or play, then we're being ignorant. If everyone says on Rotten Tomatoes, which Rotten Tomatoes I do take issue with, first off, because you can have a 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but it's a yes or no question for Rotten Tomatoes. Basically, the question they ask reviewers, or they judge by the score, do you recommend this movie? And so if a movie gets 6 out of 10, that's a recommendation. So you can have 36 out of 10 reviews. So everyone's like, yeah, it's all right. But it could get a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. And people think, oh my God, it has a 100%. It has to be good. And so I've heard this before. Friends have said this. People, when you go to watch movies, someone say, oh, if this movie's supposed to be good, it has like a 100%. Say, how about you just shut the fuck up and experience this for yourself? Maybe you might have a different opinion. And that's why having, kind of a monoculture where everybody thinks the same way is incredibly dangerous. You want to think for yourself. Rotten Tomatoes is one example. Metacritic is another example. Maybe evaluate on your own terms. And I've had a lot of examples of that happen to me where I'll listen to, let's say, an album. I'll listen to artists. I'll, once again, go deep down into their discography, listen to a lot of the different records. And my personal favorite record might be different than a lot of other people's, and that's fine. If critics feel a certain way, I might disagree. And again, that is totally valid. I think there's some degree of subjectivity when it comes to art. I do think we have absolute standards, but there is some degree when it comes to the individual. And more to the point, don't put all your trust in some random third party. Critics have notoriously been wrong often when it comes to movies, music, art, books in general, what rises to the top. I remember actually they published the original Rolling Stone review, Rolling Stone magazine review for Van Halen 1. If anybody knows anything about rock music, Van Halen 1 turned out to be a groundbreaking rock record. It introduced the world to Eddie Van Halen. It had the solo song called Eruption, where he showcased his guitar abilities. Anyways, when Rolling Stone released their review, they said, I think it was a 1 or 2 star. It did not get a good review. And the reviewer basically stated that there was nothing really new going on in that record. Meanwhile, it would turn out to be a revolutionary record for rock and would shape the tone and style of guitar playing, for better or for worse, for the next decade. But according to the critics didn't have their ear to the ground. Again, just because they have some fancy label, oh, I'm a critic, what does that mean? Does that mean you can actually evaluate things in a positive way, in an objective way, where you're able to accurately assess whether something is good or not, or is it just a label? And so a lot of times we might put all our trust in critics and they turn out to be wrong. Films are the exact same thing, where you'll take a look, again, critics, if you take a look at the Oscars, and yes, there are politics involved when it comes to who wants to watch what or what gets voted in. But if you look at the history of the Oscars, what has won Best Picture, and then you look at what has been released for that year. And if we look back in time, so a retrospective where we take a look at what won in 1970 or 1971, and then we realize, well, wait a second, the consensus these days is what won Best Picture isn't necessarily the best film of that year. And so hindsight can absolutely be useful, but thinking for yourself. Just because critics are telling you to listen to something or do something or play this game doesn't mean you have to. And once you discover your own personal taste, I can't stress that enough, personal taste, you'd be amazed how much more you enjoy things, because now you're not being told what to like. Oh, this game is great, you should play this game. Oh, this album that everyone's listening, you need to listen to this album. It's like, man, you know what? Maybe you want to listen to different things. And so something I think that flies in the face of all this, as an example, would be the genre of music known as jazz, where it's not very accessible and thus you can't sell it. It's not easily digestible. And I think when marketing and money is involved, trying to get something that's hyper palatable is very necessary in order to maximize profit. But what happens, you dumb down the audience, where you get the same song, the sounds the exact same year after year. You get movies that deal with similar themes. And this is coming from someone that read a lot of Marvel comics, DC comics growing up, but it's become so formulaic. And I think some people are realizing that when it comes to the Star Wars movies, where all the Disney movies, I don't like, quite frankly, any of them. I wouldn't say any of them are great. But finally, people have caught on where, you know, if you just try and appeal to a very broad audience and you don't really say anything worth saying, because again, you want that clean polish of mass appeal, eventually some people might notice, and that's when you need to trust your personal opinion. But a good example, talking about music, would be jazz, where jazz isn't necessarily easy to get into because it requires the individual to pay attention. It's not just background music you could put on. I mean, it is possible to do that, but it requires a little bit more from the audience. And as a result of that, again, you release a jazz song as a single, it's not going to sell as well. Well, it doesn't sell as well. Well, we're not making as much money. Let's not do that. Let's go with the sure thing. Let's do with that factory produced song. So I would say, don't trust what's popular just because it's popular. I would also say be wary of critics. Try and form your own opinions, and you'll be surprised, and you'd be, I think, happy to know how much more you enjoy things once you start listening to your internal compass. And it could expose you to a lot of different things. I mean, I remember for myself, when I saw for the first time, I probably actually saw the movie Purple Rain, just a little bit of it. I was at my aunt's house, and I think I was 18. I knew the song When Doves Cry. I thought, oh, this movie kind of seems a little lame, whatever. And then just on a whim, I heard another song or two on the radio, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to pick up one of Prince's records. And that just expanded a whole different type of music to me. Parliament Funkadelic I got into a lot of different artists as a result of that. So sometimes ignoring what you've been told, oh, wait a second, maybe you shouldn't listen, that's a little bit different. Are you sure you want to listen to that stuff? Instead, trusting that internal compass, giving things a shot, and then thinking to yourself, did I enjoy that? Did I not enjoy that? Is incredibly valuable. And so I've already spoken a little bit about the myth of popularity. I also talked about being wary of critics, trusting yourself. The last thing that I want to talk about when it comes to popularity, or when it comes to producing content, I think there are different degrees of content or different things that you could do in general when it comes to your life. And here's what I mean. I think you need to be comfortable with what you do and the vision that you have. And so when we did this podcast, it was a no-brainer for me, right? Do this podcast, talk about anything that I want, because we don't have advertisers. And even when we do, we're going to be no holds bar, which means we talk about anything and everything. We go where we want. And I think that mission statement is crucial to having a honest podcast, an honest conversation, producing something that actually comes genuinely from someone. And so for myself, when we talk about content that's being made, or what you watch, what you listen to, even what you do, let's say in your life, I think ultimately there's kind of this chasm that has happened between what people think they should do when it comes to career. Let's talk about career for a second. And then what they want to do. And I think some people might have a naive notion where, you know, they might think to themselves, oh shit, like this whole Instagram thing seems super lucrative. Let me do this. Let me try this out. I just got to post butt photos. I could make a lot of money. Hell yeah. It's like, well, okay, fine. Go ahead. Hey, do some hip thrusts if you want. If that's what your little heart desires, well, buddy, go ahead and do that. But will you find that fulfilling? And so I think the question ultimately becomes, what truly makes you happy. And that's something, going back to the internal compass, you need to discover. I think for most of us that live either in America, Canada, or in other parts of the world, we are rife with opportunities where we just have too damn many, where we can't decide what we want to do. And what ends up happening is that we do what we're told. And so we know we have to go to school. And I actually think school can be great. I think furthering your education when it comes to the university, when it comes to colleges, when it comes to trade school can be fantastic. But we don't think for ourselves. And then it happens. And I'm telling you, I've trained so many clients where this has happened to them. Doctors, lawyers, doesn't really matter, where 20 years down the line, they do what? By 30, they're married, they have kids, they have the good profession, but there's an inner emptiness. And so I think for most people, that's what happens. And they talk about that midlife crisis where they're not doing what they want to do. And so as a very, very, very simple rule of thumb, you should always try and find that internal compass, what makes you tick, and then go from there. And sometimes it won't come easily to you. You might think you like something and then it's only a passing phase and you move on from there, but you keep searching and eventually you will find. And so it's the same thing. That's why I like, one of the things that I like to do when it comes to records, I have a vinyl player. I'll go to a store and I'll put on not a random record. I'm like, okay, I know this artist, he kind of contributed with this person, he collaborated, or maybe this artist, she sang this one song that I know. Let me throw on the record, let me hear what it sounds like. And then based upon that, I judge whether or not to buy it, instead of being told, oh, you need to listen to this. And I think the novelty of self-discovery is far more powerful, once again, than being told what to think, because that's boring. And if there's anything you shouldn't be, it's boring. And so I think we're noticing that. I think that's basically what's happening online with the internet right now, where there's a lot of different groups, a lot of different niches that are being formed as a result of people finding different interests. Virtually, if you like anything, it doesn't matter. It could be ping pong. It could be playing the original Tetris and only playing the original Tetris. It could be trying to, build a real life, and I mean a real life Pokeball. Whatever you want to do, you will find a group of people that are receptive to that. And so it's about finding kind of your tribe, finding what you like, and then pursuing that. And fortunately, I'll say for us, for myself and Mike, and I can speak for him at this point, the whole lifting thing has really benefited from social media. There's some positive, there's definitely some negative, but overall, it's something good that has occurred and has allowed us to do what we do and then expand our horizon. Because I think as you begin to accomplish things, you want to accomplish more things, your ambition grows over time. I was thinking about all this where someone was talking about Avatar once again. That was the catalyst. And I don't have a huge problem with Avatar. I think it's fine, but obviously it's a huge movie. It's popular. Same idea with Force Awakens. I was having a conversation with someone, and just in an absolute scale, are those movies epic? Are they, cultural milestones? Do they contribute to culture, to art, to things that make us human? The answer would be no, not really, but they're immensely popular. And so that's what I wanted to riff on today. Trust yourself, trust what you think. And over time, if you keep searching, once again, if you keep trying to figure out what you like, you'll find it. Because I know some people, that's perhaps the last thing I'll say. A question I get when I'll mention that, some people say, well, how do I find out what I like? It's like, well, you just got to experiment. And for some people, from being told what to do in school by their parents, by society, by critics, by reviewers, for so long, they've lost that ability. They can't think for themselves. And so sometimes it's a little scary where you don't know. It's like, well, how do I actually feel about this? And so it requires a little bit of pontificating, a little bit of internal reflection, and over time, you will develop that. This has been the episode where we get into the ethos of the Mama's Boys podcast. The first solo show. There might be a few more, again, as we prepare for this massive Texas trip. Stay tuned. If you enjoyed this episode, do me a favor and pull over. Leave a rating and review on iTunes. You can also listen to this on YouTube. If you are listening on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment saying if you liked it or didn't like it. I won't be offended. Going back to broad appeal versus doing what you want. If some people don't like what you do, well, whoop-de-fucking-do. Leave that rating and review, and we'll be back every Tuesday and Friday. This is Home Air Surf Clam, the Mama's Boy, signing off.